I'd like to start out uh, saying that with the loss of my children, there were actions taken that were far beyond my control. Um, my parents had come in the middle of the night and removed my children from my home while I slept. Actually, no, my children snuck out, called them, and my parents had set up a relationship with them that they could do these things and they're with impunity. And this was part of the difficulty with the estrangement with my family, is that they were undermining my authority as their main caregiver. And they had done this for many years, and I had gone to counseling and had a great deal of depth experience in the proper healing behavior to extricate me from such codependency. However, with my physical disability and my financial situation, on the surface it seemed as though that I was the inferior to their superiority. And that's just life. And, you know, tough circumstances produce tough individuals. And I find that I need to lead with my heart to try to keep that toughness in check. It needs to understand that life is tough all over the place. It's not just happening to me. Anyway, they were instructed by attorneys to allow me no contact whatsoever, and if I wanted any contact, I would have to go to court. And they actually removed me from the premises. Asked me, required, when I went to try and see my children, they just called the police and had the police involved. They had no, they detached themselves completely from any emotionally guided behavior. And it's neither here nor there. My children are doing so well, and I'm very proud of them. So I can't say that either I or my parents were either good or bad, for my children are great. But with that said, at this time, I had a gentleman come into my life rather spontaneously. Poetry's been something that I've always done since I was very young, and I think it's because I understand the workings of confrontation and how most people just are activated physically and psychologically. They leave the building, so when they're confronted with stuff, their brain shuts off and their body takes over. And so I learned from a very young age to write, and I expressed a great deal of my inner goings on metaphorically through poetry. And I had met this guy at a coffee shop, and he said, "Dude, you got to read this book and this book and this book and this book and this author. We need to talk." And he's just a few years younger than my father, so he was like a surrogate father figure. And he turned me on to Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell actually talks about guides. Guides will come when all else fails. There'll be a guide, a spiritual guide that will lead us through those dark nights. And along with Carl Jung and some other astrologers, Liz Green, Jeff Green. Those were all great starting points for me. I was ready to absorb what Carl Jung had to say, what Campbell had to say, what both the Greens had to say, though they're not related. I could absorb it. I was retaining it and I needed it. I had no other. I was disabled. Didn't have any other. My kids were gone, and I genuinely felt something was happening because I remember just a couple weeks after being told. It was the day. It was the day after my parents told me that they wanted to have no contact. They didn't care that I needed to make my final arrangements or that this doctor had said this to me. They may have cared, but they were following not what their heart told them, but what the attorneys told them and the authorities told them. And to this day, I question my mother and my father's choices because they never let their heart lead them. They let someone tell them what they should do. And as a result, I knew this as their son. I knew this as their offspring, that they weren't being genuine, but they were safe. They did the safe thing, and they've done well by it. And I don't blame them. Looking at my life. My God, what I had to go through. I didn't play it safe, but I played it genuine. So, Campbell said somewhere, I recently heard it. It may have been on the recent documentary about him called Finding Joe. Somebody may have posted it as a quote of his on Facebook. I don't know where I got it. But he said, I think, the first half of life for man is surrendering the ego. The second half of life is surrendering the phallus. Now, I'm not sure about this surrendering of the phallus thing, but I could see the ego blows, the blows to my ego, my self-conception, my self-image was shattered over and over and over and over. And I had a great deal of solace discovered in the psychological interpretation of the Buddhist thought that helps to detach ourselves from our experiences and observe our behavior and observe ourselves, observe the world around us as from a detached point of view. I remember sitting in the hot tub doing my physical therapy, and it was like warm honey poured over me. I said, F it. If I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out sober. I'm not going to get off all these pain pills, these antidepressants. I'm going to go ahead to my 99% chance of death completely hoorah. I'm going to go for it. And I didn't take any more pain pills. Didn't have any withdrawals. I was in heavy narcotics. All doctor prescribed. Everything I was doing was doctor prescribed. There was, I was always under the care of physicians and doing what my physicians told me to do. They did me right. And I had a whole shift in consciousness. I had no withdrawals. Oh, I remember there was another thing that happened that was a near-death experience, and it has to do with authority. You know, I had this idea that authority behaved a certain way, but I was coming from my own experience of how I would behave if I was put in that situation. Not from a situation of living it, but in a situation of if I had this kind of power, I would da 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 da. Well, I had highway patrol officers. I was assaulted by a teenage driver with a car. I was driving my car. He rammed me purposefully, and because he came from a rich side of town and I came from the low-income apartments. Because his father was a district attorney in a local town, a large town, locally. I was seen as the bad guy. I had false charges brought up against me. My daughter was a witness to this. The cops said they had searched my car and found marijuana. Lie. Didn't happen. So, long story short, they took me to the hospital, released me at the hospital, never gave me a ticket, kept calling the Highway Patrol. 5 weeks later, the chief or lieutenant or whoever's in charge over the guy that was supposed to do the report said, I'll send it out to you. This is the 5th time you've called every week. I'll send it out to you when he's done with it. Never sent it to me. A year later, or not a year later, months later, my parents found out that I had a warrant out for my arrest. There was a warrant out for my arrest. When I called the police about my children being removed from my house against my will, they arrested me on a warrant for a ticket I never received, for charges that nobody ever charged me with, as far as I knew. And all the charges ended up being dropped if I just went to parenting courses for 6 weeks. My kids were not in the car when it occurred. My kids were not involved in the situation at all. And then I realized that the whole system is doing whatever it damn well pleases, not what it must. And such is life, you know? How many of us do what we damn well please and not what we must? And my whole image of the authorities really shifted. I mean, I had small messages throughout my youth. I'd always been one of those people that confronted authority and said, okay, what is this really about here? Because I needed answers. I needed to understand limits. I needed to understand power and the exercise of power, because it just didn't seem to make any sense to me. So I'd had these little messages all along, and this was a big realization that it's all up to me, baby. And that even those that seem to hold positions of honor and prestige are every bit as human as all of us. That was when all this stuff came together, my realization was so intensified by all of these different experiences that I felt a tremendous release. The tension left me. I could regulate and moderate my pain on my own. I released myself from the bonds of needing to portray any of what I identified myself as before all of this.